She walked in with a pen in her hand and professionalism on her face. As a journalist, she had covered wars, disasters, and human tragedies, but nothing had prepared her for what she was about to witness. The assignment seemed simple: attend a local Muharram gathering and document the rituals for a cultural feature. She expected formality, maybe a few emotional stories, and perhaps a religious ceremony she couldn't relate to. But what she found inside that gathering shook her soul in a way no battlefield ever had. The moment she stepped into the hall, she sensed something different. It was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that comes from silence. It was heavy, sacred. The air felt charged, as if grief itself had taken a seat in every corner. People were seated in rows, some in black attire, some with tear-stained faces. And yet there was a calmness among them, a calmness that wasn't sad but sincere. As she listened to the speaker recount the events of Karbala, she found herself frozen. These weren't just religious tales. This was a story of loyalty, of a man who stood against a tyrant, not for power, but for principle. Imam Hussain refused to bow. He chose death over dishonor. He chose sacrifice over silence. And his family, including children and women, stood beside him, not as victims, but as witnesses to truth. She had heard of wars. She had written about brave soldiers. But this was different. This was a battlefield where one side had swords and the other had hearts. She found herself captivated not just by the story, but by the people around her. They weren't just remembering the past, they were reliving it. Every tear they shed was for a man who had given his life centuries ago, yet his pain still echoed in their hearts. She watched as grown men wept like children, as women raised their hands in prayer with eyes full of grief, yet lit with faith. What shook her even more was the sincerity. There was no theatrics, no performance, just raw emotion, unfiltered sorrow, and deep love for a man she had never heard of before that night. She realized this gathering wasn't about religion alone. It was about a bond between the soul and the truth. She saw strangers holding each other as if they shared a common wound. She saw children sitting quietly, absorbing the energy of the room, as if they were born with this story in their blood. As she sat there, forgetting her notes and recording equipment, she felt something rise in her chest, a lump in her throat, a burning behind her eyes. And before she could stop herself, she felt a tear slide down her cheek. It wasn't because of the words being spoken, it was because of what she felt deep inside. For the first time in her life, she wasn't observing grief, she was inside it. That night, she walked out of the Majlis silently. She didn't know what to write, because some stories can't be captured in headlines or articles. Some truths are too sacred for words. All she knew was this: she came to report a ritual. She left having touched a revolution, and something in her heart would never be the same again. She sat near the back of the gathering, notebook resting on her lap, eyes scanning the crowd with curiosity. It was the first night of the Muharram Majlis she had agreed to cover. Her editor thought it would make a compelling cultural piece. A human interest story, he called it. But as the reciter took the microphone and began, something unexpected started unfolding. The crowd, silent a moment ago, now breathed as one. The speaker wasn't just telling a story. He was unveiling a soul-stirring tragedy that wasn't dead history. It was alive in every heart present. She didn't know who Imam Hussain truly was beyond the few lines she had read online. But the moment the name was uttered with reverence, she could sense the weight it carried. The story of Karbala came alive not through theatrics, but through truth, piercing, raw, and unforgettable. The speaker's voice trembled as he described the scene of a small group standing against an army, of a family choosing death over surrender, of a man who gave everything for justice, love, and God. Her chest tightened. These weren't just characters, they were people. A 6-month-old baby dying of thirst. A sister watching her brother fall. A leader refusing to curse his enemies even as he bled to death. Around her, people wept openly. They weren't embarrassed, they weren't performative. They were simply connected to something greater, something eternal. For the first time in her life, she saw a community collectively feeling something sacred. It wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about preaching, it was about remembrance, about the power of sacrifice, about the soul's connection to a truth too deep for words. She had covered protests and resistance movements before, but this was a spiritual uprising that had outlived centuries, and somehow, in the midst of it, her own walls started to crack. She wiped her eyes before anyone could notice, but the tears weren't out of sadness. They were from something far more profound. Something had touched her. She wasn't sure if it was the story, the atmosphere, or the sincerity, but she knew this wasn't just another assignment. It was the beginning of a question she could no longer ignore. The next day, she returned, not as a journalist chasing a deadline, but as someone quietly drawn to something she couldn't fully explain. She told herself it was just research, just more notes for her article. But deep down, she knew it was more. Something inside her had been stirred the night before, and she needed to feel it again. This time, she chose to sit a little closer to the front, closer to the energy that had unsettled her soul in the most unexpected way. As the recitation began, she didn't bother with her notebook. She simply listened. The speaker described the moments leading up to the final day of Karbala, the night when Imam Hussain gathered his few loyal companions and offered them freedom. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. He gave them the chance to walk away, to save their lives, and yet not one of them left. Even knowing death was certain, they chose to stay. This wasn't just loyalty, it was love, a love for a man they believed represented truth itself. It was the kind of love that had nothing to do with personal gain and everything to do with spiritual conviction. She looked around again, this time not as an outsider. She saw people with closed eyes, heads bowed, tears silently falling. No one was watching her. No one cared about how they looked. They were present in the pain, immersed in remembrance, connected to a history that felt alive. The sound of Ya Hussein echoed gently through the hall like a heartbeat, pulsing with something timeless. And for a moment, she didn't feel like a stranger anymore. Her own heart felt heavier, but not in a painful way. It was the kind of weight that comes with awakening, with realizing there's a depth to humanity and faith she had never experienced. She had come expecting rituals and left witnessing spiritual resistance, an unshakable bond between truth and grief. She didn't know what was happening inside her, but she knew something had changed. She was no longer there to observe, she was there to feel. And that feeling was growing stronger with every word spoken. On the third evening, the journalist found herself arriving early, almost impatient to be present before the Majlis began. The hall was still filling, soft murmurs and greetings flowing like a gentle current. She didn't carry her camera or notebook this time. Something had shifted. She wasn't covering the story anymore, she was being covered by it. And tonight, the speaker began with the story of Ali Asghar, the infant son of Imam Hussain. She listened intently as the speaker described the scorching heat of Karbala, the thirst that burned through the camp of Hussain, and the father who carried his baby in his arms, not to shield him from harm, but to plead for a drop of water. The mother's eyes followed him, filled with hope, perhaps even belief in the mercy of humanity. And then the unthinkable happened. The baby was struck with an arrow while still in his father's arms. The journalist froze. It wasn't just a sad story. It was unbearable. She felt something rise in her throat, as if the grief had found a home in her own chest. She looked around and saw tears falling like quiet rain from nearly every face in the room. Men who looked strong and reserved were weeping openly. Women clutched their hearts as if holding the pain inside. Children sat in silence, eyes wide, absorbing a truth that reached far beyond their age. For the first time, she felt the Karbala narrative in her own being. Not as history, not as religion, but as a universal tragedy. What kind of people kill a child in the arms of his father? And what kind of strength allows that father to bury him with his own hands, still refusing to surrender to injustice? It broke her deeply, yet somehow rebuilt something inside her too. When the Majlis ended, she remained seated. She didn't want to leave. She didn't want to forget. That night, she didn't cry because of religion. She cried because her soul had heard something it couldn't unhear. The story of Hussain and Karbala had planted itself inside her, and something within was starting to bloom. By the fourth day, the Majlis no longer felt like a foreign place to her. The space that once seemed distant and unfamiliar now carried a strange comfort. She sat among people she didn't know, yet somehow felt connected to them in ways she couldn't explain. Tonight, the speaker focused not on the battlefield, but on a woman, Zainab, the sister of Imam Hussain. The story was not just about what she witnessed in Karbala, but what she carried after the tragedy. And that story, in its strength and sorrow, left the journalist utterly speechless. She had covered many stories of war and aftermath, but she had never encountered a figure like Zainab, a woman who saw her entire family slaughtered before her eyes, including her children, and yet did not break. A woman who was taken prisoner, paraded through the streets in chains, yet stood tall before the tyrant who caused it all and declared, "I saw nothing but beauty." The room was silent, the air heavy with respect and grief. The journalist had heard many definitions of strength in her life, but this was something else, something spiritual, something divine. He watched the women around her react with silent tears, gentle sobs, and hands covering their faces. These weren't just followers of a tradition. They were mirrors of Zainab's strength. They mourned her pain, but they also carried her legacy. The journalist realized that this wasn't just a story about loss. It was about resilience that refused to be crushed. Karbala didn't end with death. It continued through the voice of a woman who refused to let the truth be buried with the martyrs. Something inside her shifted again. She had come to learn about a people's mourning, but had found something deeper, how faith turns pain into power. She began to understand why generations cry for Karbala, why people pass this story to their children, why it survives not just in books but in hearts. That night, she didn't take any notes. She just sat there, quietly overwhelmed. For the first time, she felt that witnessing wasn't about writing. It was about absorbing. She came seeking a story, but now she was living inside one. On the fifth night, something felt different inside her. The journalist who once arrived with a checklist now came with a longing, not just to witness, but to understand. As she stepped into the hall, she noticed the black banners, the glowing lights, the murmurs of prayers echoing gently. It was no longer just an event for her. It had become a sacred space. The speaker began with a powerful reflection. Why does the world still cry for Hussain after more than 1,400 years? The question lingered in her mind like a whisper waiting to be answered. Tonight, the story was about Abbas, the loyal brother of Hussain, a warrior known not just for his strength, but for his unwavering devotion. She listened as the speaker recounted how Abbas refused to drink water, even when dying of thirst, because his master's children still suffered in the camp. A man with every right to save himself, yet he chose loyalty over life. When his arms were cut in battle, He held the flag of Hussein with his shoulders. When his eyes were wounded, he still moved toward the river, only to return without a single drop, dying in service, not defeat. The journalist couldn't hold back her tears. This wasn't just a tale of sacrifice. It was a lesson in values the world seemed to have forgotten. Loyalty without agenda, courage without arrogance, faith without condition. She realized that Karbala wasn't about religion alone. It was a blueprint for every human being who chooses truth over convenience. In Abbas, she saw the kind of loyalty that made the soul ache with reverence. The crowd mourned collectively, but it wasn't hopeless grief. It was sacred remembrance. The tears weren't signs of weakness. They were proof of connection, proof that the hearts in that hall were still beating for something pure. The journalist wiped her tears, not ashamed but humbled. These people weren't crying for a loss. They were crying because they understood the cost of standing for truth. And somehow she now understood too. This wasn't a ritual. It was a revival. A reminder that even in death, honor lives on. And she, a stranger, had been welcomed into that eternal memory. On the sixth night, the journalist felt something awaken in her that she couldn't name. Each evening had peeled away another layer of distance between her and the story of Karbala. What started as an assignment had become a transformation. Tonight, the Majlis began with the story of the aftermath. The day after Ashura, Imam Hussain and his companions had been martyred. The battlefield was silent, but their message had just begun. The speaker's voice trembled as he described how the women and children of Hussein's camp were taken as prisoners. Among them stood Zainab, now the guardian of a legacy soaked in blood, but glowing with divine strength. The journalist was stunned by the thought that such sorrow did not lead to silence. Instead, it gave birth to a voice that defied oppression. Zainab stood in the courts of the very tyrants who had killed her family, and with words sharp as swords, exposed their cruelty. She didn't break. She didn't beg. She bore the burden of Karbala with dignity, turning captivity into a revolution. The journalist realized that Hussein's battle did not end in death. It continued through the courage of those who survived. She saw how the mourning in the room was not just for the fallen heroes, but also for the strength of those who carried their message forward. The women in the gathering weren't just crying. They were inheritors of Zainab's voice. The children weren't just spectators. They were being raised with Hussein's truth etched into their hearts. The journalist had never seen pain honored in this way. It wasn't treated as something to hide. It was held like a treasure, remembered like a flame that refused to go out. To everyone who welcomed her without judgment, who shared tears and prayers, she silently thanked them. Their grief had taught her more about courage than any war she'd ever reported. Their remembrance had awakened a part of her she didn't know existed, a part that now longed for something deeper, something more than just facts and headlines. Thank you for watching this heartfelt journey. If this touched you even a little, share it forward. Let the message of Hussein continue to move hearts, break barriers, and awaken souls. Because some stories aren't meant to be closed, they are meant to be carried. May the spirit of Karbala live in our actions, our compassion, and our unwavering stand for truth.